All right.
Okay,
All right.
perfect.
Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. This is the first meeting for the Philosophy Club in fall of 2023. And our first guest speaker for this semester is Dr. Graham Oppy. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Oppy?
Sure. I'm a professor of philosophy at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I've specialised in philosophy of religion. In particular, I've spent a lot of time thinking about arguments about the existence of God.
Gotcha, gotcha. So one of the books that caught my attention that you've written is your book, The Best Argument Against God. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's about?
Okay, so the title kind of gives it away. What I'd been working on arguments for and against the existence of God for a long time, and I thought about what would be the strongest argument that you could make against the existence of God. And in the book, I set out what I think is going to be, what I still think is the strongest argument. I do argue at the end of the book that it's not a successful argument. It's not an argument that if you happen to believe in God, you'd be irrational in thinking that the argument wasn't persuasive, right? So I'm not claiming that it's a successful argument. I'm just claiming that it's the best of what you might call a bad lot, right? There are lots of arguments for and against the existence of God. My view is that none of them are strong enough to be such that you're kind of rationally compelled to accept their conclusion, whatever it is, that God exists, that God doesn't exist, that you should suspend judgment about whether there's a God or whatever.
Gotcha, gotcha. My understanding was that in the book you compare naturalism and theism and argue that both of them have the same, what's the word or the phrase, explanatory power. Is my memory correct?
So that's not quite right. What I do is I say, well, we're going to compare two theories. So imagine you've got some best version of theism and some best version of naturalism, a kind of best theistic worldview and a best naturalistic worldview. And we're going to compare them. And it will turn out, I think, that the naturalistic worldview is simpler. It's kind of committed to less. And then I argue, according to the argument that I give, that there's no kind of, if you think about dividing the data up in some kind of non-gerrymandered way, there's no data that's explained better by theism than it is by naturalism. I leave it open for somebody who wants to run this argument that they might argue that there's some data that's better explained by naturalism, right? But that's not important to the argument, because the way the argument goes is if there's nothing that's better explained by theism and naturalism is simpler, then you've got a reason, right, to be a naturalist rather than a theist. So that's how the argument goes. Whether it's, I mean, obviously, one of the things, and I point this out at the end of the book, one of the things that's highly controversial is whether there isn't some data that's better explained by theism than by naturalism. And it's equally controversial whether there isn't some data that's better explained by naturalism than by theism. But I didn't need that for the argument that I was developing in the book.
Gotcha, gotcha. Thank you for the clarification. So how would you define, just for the new people here, how would you define naturalism and theism? How is it being used in your book?
Okay, so I'm thinking about, so I actually don't remember exactly what definition I gave of theism in the book. So I'm thinking that theism ought to be the claim that there's at least one God. Typically in these debates, you talk to people who think that there's exactly one God, God with a capital G. There are people who think that really it's kind of wrong to think of God with a capital G as a God. But the way that I'm thinking about it is that if there are gods, but they have an exercise power over everything else, and it's kind of a view that's pretty widespread amongst monotheists that whatever else is true of God, and there's lots of disagreement about that, God has and exercises power over everything else. And so that makes it appropriate to say that God's a God, without thinking that there's a genus here to which God belongs, because if there's only one God, presumably it's going to be necessary. There couldn't possibly have been more gods, right? Okay, so that's how I'm thinking about theism, and a theistic worldview is just going to be one that incorporates the claim that there is at least one God. Naturalism, I'm thinking about as a claim, about causal reality. So the idea is that amongst the causal things, there are only natural things, and they only have natural causal powers. Right? I'm not claiming, as many naturalists do, that somehow or other, once you've got that much, you can explain everything. I think that, for example, that story doesn't tell you anything about values. Values and norms, those things don't reduce to causal powers. They're additional things in a naturalistic worldview. But what's distinctive of a naturalistic worldview is it says that the only causal entities and powers there are natural, and typically what will follow from that is that they also think that the way that we determine what causal entities and powers there are is by way of science, right? So science tells you about the natural causal entities and the natural causal powers. And so if there are things that people are postulating, giving them causal powers that are not subject to scientific study, then they'll turn out not to be naturalistic, and the gods fall into that category. They're supposed to be things that have and exercise power over the natural world. So of course, they're not themselves natural. They don't have natural causal powers. That's how I'm thinking about it.
Gotcha. Would it be appropriate to say that your argument's like a Bayesian argument, an argument of probability or possibility?
So it could be couched that way, right? That's not the way I do it. I worry about whether you can talk about sensibly ascribe probabilities to some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the argument. So I prefer to think about it in terms of theoretical virtues, right? We've got two theories. How do we assess them? Well, we look to see how they trade off simplicity, which is kind of minimizing commitments, against explanatory power, how much they can explain, assuming some notion of what the data is that needs to be explained. Now, Bayesians think that there's kind of a method for doing this, because simplicity is basically high prior probability, and then explanation is basically having high likelihoods, right? And then Bayes' theorem connects those notions together. The ratio of posterior probabilities is the product of the ratio of the prior probabilities and the ratio of the likelihoods. So you could certainly cast my argument in a Bayesian light, but I prefer not to do that. You might think, okay, so I didn't tell you how do you do it, how do you do this trade-off? And in lots of cases you can't do it, but there are clear cases where you can, where you've got dominance, where you've got one theory that's clearly simpler than the other, and in every case where you look at the data, it explains the data just as well or better than the other theory, then clearly that's the better theory. So you don't need Bayes' theorem to get a result if the case goes that way. Yep.
Gotcha. That's how I've thought about it. And that's how I usually think about a lot of these arguments, arguing that a certain proposition is likely, right? It's counting the evidence and seeing how likely it is under a hypothesis. So in your book, do you argue that naturalism is a more simple theory than theism?
Yes, so I definitely do that. And I argue it? It goes very quickly. So this is the way that I'm going to say this, some theists find acceptable and others do not, right? So I think what's in common is science, the natural world. Both theists and naturalists are committed to that. It's just that the naturalist says that's all there is, and the theist says, no, wait, there's stacks more. there's at least God, but there might also be angels and demons, all kinds of other stuff that the naturalist is not going to accept. And that just makes the theistic theory less simple, because now you've got a whole lot of stuff describing, perhaps giving laws that apply to domains that the naturalist just doesn't accept. Whereas when it comes to the natural stuff, you don't get any simplification. It's not like physics suddenly becomes more simple if you suppose that God exists. The equations remain as they are, just as complicated. The way that you describe the physical phenomena is not simplified in the least, right? So of course, naturalism is simpler. As I said, not all theists accept the account that I just gave. In particular, for example, we were talking before we came on about Josh Rasmussen, and he doesn't accept this. But somebody like Paul Moser does. He just thinks that it's kind of obvious that naturalism is simpler, but there are other reasons why you should prefer, having to do with what gets explained or what gets made intelligible by the theory.
Gotcha. How would you respond to like a critic like Richard Swinburne, who says that theism is actually very simple because all you're doing is postulating a necessary being with three attributes, simple attributes?
So any addition, no matter how simple, is an addition, right? I mean, given his background was actually in philosophy of science, and he's committed to natural reality, right? And naturalists are also committed to natural reality. And we don't, I mean, ignoring some small details, we could talk about this, I mean, some details about history. We don't disagree about anything. We agree about the age of the universe and about evolutionary theory, a whole lot of other stuff, right? All of that stuff. But he adds in an extra thing. It doesn't matter how simple it is. It's an addition. And so his theory overall is less simple. Right? That's how I see the calculation going.
Gotcha. Okay, I see what you mean. So in your book, you also do differentiate between minimal theism and standard theism. How would you define those two, and what's the difference?
So when people argue about the existence of God, sometimes they'll say, I'm not arguing for the God of my religion. I'm not arguing for the Christian God. I'm just going to argue that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good creator of all else. Sometimes the conception of God might be even more minimal than that. But usually in the arguments in philosophy, it's going to have at least that much in it, right? So the kind of triple O, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and creator of everything else. But so Swinburne, in his book on the existence of God, it's something not much more elaborate than that he's arguing for. But in his book, Is Jesus God?, he argues for a much more complicated view of God, where you've got Trinity, incarnation, a whole lot of other stuff going on as well. That perhaps doesn't fully cover the field, because you could imagine in between the view that just says that fairly simple to state conception of God, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good creator of all else. There might be something in between where there's quite a bit more that you pack into that, because you say that God's perfect, and then you unpack what perfection requires. And there might be a whole lot of other stuff about love and various other things that might be in there. And you might still think of that as fairly standard. Whereas I'm thinking that the standard bit might be what's in common between the Abrahamic religions. So how much will Muslims and Jews and Christians agree on? Obviously, going Trinity and incarnation, we've moved way beyond what Muslims and Jews will accept.
Gotcha. So the takeaway here from the book is that naturalism is, I want to be careful how I word it. It's not that naturalism is just as probable than theism. It's how would you word it?
So if you accepted my argument, then you would, and you wanted to couch it in Bayesian terms, that's exactly how you would say it. The posterior probability of naturalism on the evidence is a little bit higher than the posterior probability of theism on the evidence. That's what the argument says, but it's important to remember that I don't think that the argument works, right? It's not a successful argument. It's not an argument that if you're a theist and you're presented with this argument, you should think, oh, well, pack up the tent and go home. I'm going to be a naturalist. Right? I just don't think that the argument's that powerful. But if you happen to think that the argument was successful, then the way that you said it is the right way to think about it.
Gotcha. I think of all these arguments in Bayesian ways. I mean, that's just kind of how I've been doing it for a while. So unrelated to your book, I want to move away from your book for a little bit. So cumulative arguments for the existence of God. Do you think those are stronger than, I guess we would call like standard arguments for God, where it's like the ontological argument, like alone, versus like several arguments being put together?
So I guess there are two distinctions here. One distinction that's standardly made is between kind of deductive arguments and non-deductive arguments. So if you think that you've got a deductive argument for the existence or non-existence of God, I think that you're very likely mistaken, right? Before we even look at the details of it, it seems very unlikely to me that you're going to have something that you think something that ought to persuade everybody to be a theist or a naturalist, where you've got a bunch of premises and there's a logic, as you've got the conclusion that naturalism is true or theism is true as a logical consequence of those premises. I don't think anything like that's going to work. But then on the other hand, sort of contrasting with that, you might have abductive or inductive arguments, abductive arguments, especially arguments that will go by inference to the best explanation. And it seems that the prospects for arguments like that is higher than the prospects for deductive arguments. So that's kind of one distinction. But then the other thing that you might think is that there's a lot of arguments out there. If you sort of combine the considerations from a bunch of different arguments, surely you'll make a stronger case than if you just focus on considerations about one. So, if all I consider is cosmological considerations, surely my argument's not going to be as strong as if I also consider take into account stuff about morality and laws of nature and a whole lot of other stuff that's not got nothing to do with the Big Bang, right? It just seems as though it's bound to be a stronger case the more you take into account. So I certainly think that the most promising arguments are cumulative case arguments, and so it's no surprise that the best argument against God is a cumulative case argument.
Gotcha. But you don't think that like, for example, a philosopher like Swinburne succeeds even with the cumulative case?
Well, no more than I do, right? And I guess my sort of in the background, my view is that philosophy all over the place, you find people who are as well informed as anybody is about all of the relevant considerations, just disagreeing, right? Pick almost any proposition and philosophers disagree about it. It would be very surprising if there are kind of compelling arguments and in all of these cases, and yet the philosophers are not being brought to agreement by those arguments. Surely the arguments that we've got must be insufficient to compel agreement about free will or realism or nihilism or whatever you like, right? All the philosophical topics, because there's a spectrum of opinion. Right? So from that, adopting that standpoint and thinking about things that way, I just think that it's incredibly unlikely that there are successful arguments about the existence of God, because the existence of God is one of the big philosophical questions, and there's just no convergence of opinion amongst all the people that devote their lives to studying this topic. Right now, that view could be undermined. You could come up with an argument and say, but look, when here's this argument, and everybody who's presented with this argument, they just change their mind, converge on the conclusion. But there's no, I think to date, we have no such argument. And it's not just this topic about the existence of God, it's pretty much every topic in philosophy that goes like that. So I think that you have to have the view that it's perfectly permissible for informed, intelligent, thoughtful, reasonable people to disagree about questions like this. And so you shouldn't think that you've got a compelling argument. Right? That you'll just be making a mistake if that's what you think.
Gotcha. Speaking of arguments for the existence of God, earlier before we started the meeting, we discussed the ontological argument, but the classical argument for theism. Why do you think it doesn't work?
So, I mean, I can answer this question more generally. Once we're thinking about a single argument with a set of premises and a conclusion, I think that this is what you in fact find. Any argument for or against the existence of God, the people who disagree with the conclusion will do one of the following things. They'll rightly point out that the conclusion isn't supported by the premises, or they'll reject one or more of the premises, right? And that's just always turns out to be the case.
Gotcha. So would you just argue that the argument, like in its original form, is not valid?
So that's the first bit, that the conclusion doesn't follow, isn't properly supported by the premises. So I want to allow that we could be dealing not with deductive arguments, but with, say, abductive arguments where the conclusion's supported abductively by the premises. Then it's not a matter of validity, but it's a matter of correctly assessing sort of whether this is the best inference to draw from the data, whether this conclusion is the one that's most strongly supported by the data.
Gotcha.
So I mean, speaking loosely, you might talk about validity, but I think of validity as a term that philosophers reserve for logical consequence. So if we're talking about abductive consequence, we're not talking about validity. That's why I said properly supported by the premises, right? So you might disagree about, if someone gives you an argument that relies on inference to the best explanation, you might say, no, that's not the best conclusion to draw. Or you might say, but I don't accept the premises that your argument relies on.
Gotcha. You've also written a lot, if I'm not mistaken, on the problem of evil. Is that correct?
A bit, yeah.
Gotcha. I think you wrote a paper arguing that correct me if I'm wrong, that the logical problem of evil doesn't work. Is that correct?
So I mean, given what I've already said, you can tell that I'm committed to the claim that none of the arguments from evil are successful. There are arguments from evil that I like, and there are arguments from evil that are less good. So I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about arguments from evil that people have presented in the past. So people like John Mackey, Bill Rowe, they have very well-known arguments from evil, and what I think about their arguments is that it's kind of obvious that there are premises that their arguments involve that theists quite reasonably don't accept. Right. So this is very clear for Mackey. So I'll give you an example. So Mackey says the following set of claims is inconsistent. God's omnipotent, God's perfectly good, God exists. A good being eliminates evil as far as it can, and there are no limits on what an omnipotent being can do. And plausibly, those claims are jointly inconsistent. But if you ask theists, they typically don't think that a good being eliminates evil as far as it can. Rather, what a good being does is seeks to bring about the best overall balance of good over evil. And it might be that in order to have certain kinds of goods, you've got to permit a certain amount of evil. Right? That's something that Mackey himself pointed out in his paper. In effect, he was saying the argument that he presented was unsuccessful. But right, that's a way of saying that his argument didn't work. And there's something similar that you can show about Rowe's argument as well. He's assuming something that theists typically don't accept, or that at any rate, theists, it's perfectly rational rationally permissible for them to reject it.
Uh-huh. My understanding of your work on this is that you didn't think that, that you didn't think the arguments from evil worked, but you also didn't think many theodicies worked either, like in particular the free will theodicy.
So I think that there are people who think that somehow or other Planting has showed that there couldn't possibly be a successful logical argument from evil. And I don't think that's right. I think that it's always an open question whether there's some contradiction in a theory that hasn't been recognized yet. Right, there are examples from history, like Frege thought that he had this really neat axiomatization of arithmetic, and then Russell pointed out that there was a problem, that his axioms are actually contradictory. And so it's possible, right, that naturalism or theism actually their commitments are contradictory, but we certainly have no demonstration yet that that's the case. But maybe someone like Russell will come along one day and show that actually the kind of naturalistic principles that I accept are jointly inconsistent. That could happen. And there's no way that Plantinga's argument shows that theism is consistent, which is what he would need to have proved in order to rule out the possibility that someone might come along one day and demonstrate an inconsistency. Right. So the what's called the free will defense just can't do what Plantinga seems to have claimed that it did.
So, assuming we're thinking of the same book, God, Freedom, and Evil, right, where he talks about the theodicy.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. There's some problems with it. And in particular, he doesn't differentiate between what type of free will he's advocating for. Is he talking about libertarian free will, or is he talking about something else? That's something he doesn't make a distinction between, and it seems he's been criticized for that. I don't think it's that he can't do it. I think he can, but he try to make the book, which I have it here with me, accessible for a popular audience. It doesn't really just make the distinction. Do you think that the distinction matters as to what type of free will you're advocating for solves the contradiction or inconsistency?
So let me back up a bit. Plantinga draws a distinction between defense and theodicy, and in the nature of necessity, he's only arguing for defense. He's not arguing for a particular theodicy. What he says is things could be this way, and if they were this way, which I'm not committing to, there would be no problem, right? So I'm not sure whether in the other book, God, Freedom and Evil, he's actually fully committing himself to a theodicy there either, though he does rely on some claims about freedom when he's trying to argue for the consistency of theism with the existence of evil, or even a significant amount of evil.
That's fair. Yeah.
But on the question about thinking, different ways of thinking about freedom, should we adopt a compatibilist view that freedom is consistent with determinism? Should we adopt some kind of libertarian view, either thinking that in order for you to act freely, it's got to be possible for you to do something else in the very circumstances in which you're acting, or because that kind of view has become less popular, at least in academic circles recently, at least that you have to be the source of your actions, in some sense of source of your actions. Theists divide about this. There are theistic compatibilists. There are theists who are determinists, who nonetheless think that they can tell a story about the value of freedom, right? So the landscape, at least within academic philosophy of religion, is quite complex. And it's not straightforwardly the case that the kind of naturalists all cleave to compatibilism and the theists all cleave to some kind of libertarianism. So there are people like Evan Fales, who's a naturalist, who cleaves to something like libertarianism. And if I think about it, I could probably name, I'm not drawing a blank at the moment, but I know that there are theists who cleave to compatibilism. And one of the things that's kind of interesting historically is the extent to which Aquinas's theology actually leaves room for libertarian freedom. It's not clear that Aquinas was really a proponent of libertarian freedom. It seems kind of plausible that really he was a kind of theological compatibilist, so that historically also there's not a neat division here.
Mm-hmm. That well said. I looked back at his book, and you're right. He does make a distinction between theodicy and defense, and he's just simply making a defense that, like, a possible explanation for the inconsistency or contradiction that exists. He doesn't say he like fully commits himself to it. And I think that's the way a lot of Christian philosophers think about it, as a defense, because they're not totally sure why it is that evil exists and God exists, but rather here's a possible explanation as to why these two things exist.
Right. And this, I mean, the way that you've put it there, this becomes even clearer when we move to talk about Rowe's argument, because what gets called skeptical theism is one of the most popular ways of responding to Rowe's argument. And there, the claim that's made is, well, sure, God's got reasons, but we're incapable of appreciating what those reasons are, right? Why should we think that just because God has some reasons for allowing awful things to happen, that we'd be the first to know what those reasons are? After all, God's omniscient and omnipotent, and we're not close to either of those, right? So if you're taking that kind of view, you're not claiming to be able to give anything that you might think of as an old style theodicy, explaining what God's reasons are. You're saying, well, couldn't know what the reasons are, but that's okay, because we've got other reasons, for really solid reasons for thinking that God exists. And so God must have reasons, even if we're not privy to them.
Gotcha. So two more questions here before I move on to Q&A. Do you think that skeptical theism is self-defeating?
So I have written on this topic. I worry that that skeptical theism is hard to contain, that the kind of reasons that people have that they're adverting to when they're kind of setting up their case for skeptical theism will lead to a kind of skepticism about morality in circumstances where it shouldn't. So God's got reasons for permitting we're going to suppose God's got reasons for permitting awful things. Suppose I'm in a situation where one of these awful things is happening and I could prevent it. Should I do it? Maybe God doesn't want me to, because God's got reasons for wanting this awful thing to happen, right? So now there's a kind of ordinary morality now becomes a bit complicated, right? Because it's not clear that my thinking that God's got reasons for permitting these awful things isn't going to interfere with my own moral reasoning about what I ought to do to try to prevent this awful thing from happening. So that was the kind of crude thought, right, about the way in which skeptical theism might be an awful can of worms to have opened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to be the issue, that sure, you can, I guess, avoid the problem of evil, but you also start, there's a lot of traps you run into, like about morality and whether it entails too much skepticism. I think that seems to be the issue. So my last question is, and here's a fun one, what got you into philosophy?
Okay, so that's it's a long time ago now, right? So it's kind of hard to remember. I grew up as a kind of conventional theist. So my family background is, at least on the Oppy side, it's Cornish miners who were Methodists from the time that the Wesleys started preaching in Cornwall in the, I guess, the 18th century. And so I grew up with a kind of conventional religion. And when I was 12 or 13, over a period of a few weeks, I thought about it and decided I just didn't believe it. Right? That was any of it. I can't remember the details. I just know that's what happened. And after that, I really enjoyed arguing with people about religion. My teachers at school, friends, and so on. And so I had that kind of interest. For my 16th birthday, I was given a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography, which I read. And that was what made me think I'd like to be a philosopher. I'd like to be like Russell and lead that kind of life. So it wasn't kind of, at that point, it definitely wasn't determined that I'd go into philosophy of religion. It wasn't even determined that I'd become a philosopher, but I had an interest when I was at school. When I got to university, I did a year of medicine and decided I was never going to be a doctor. And so then I swapped and I studied arts and sciences. So I did a major in maths and a major in philosophy. And at that stage, I thought maybe I'd be a mathematician, but I just seemed to be better at philosophy. So I followed philosophy through. That's kind of the story. It's not that interesting, really.
Gotcha. Well, still, thank you for sharing with us, and that concludes our interview with Dr. Oppy, and now we will move on to the Q&A session. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Oppy. Right,
okay, I look
Hannah,
forward to the questions.
Yeah, Hannah, can you stop recording, please?
Yes.
Okay.